She shielded her commander with her body, then grabbed his M4 and cleared the field. The crimson sand of Kepler 442b swirled around Staff Sergeant Maria Santos as she adjusted her tactical visor against the alien world's twin suns. 3 months into what was supposed to be a routine peacekeeping mission, the human coalition forces had learned that nothing about this planet was routine. The indigenous Zephyrian species had seemed peaceful enough during first contact, their tall, graceful forms and melodic language giving the impression of a sophisticated, non-violent civilization. That illusion had shattered 2 weeks ago when the extremist faction known as the Crimson Talon began their systematic attacks on human outposts. What made them particularly dangerous wasn't just their advanced plasma weaponry or their intimate knowledge of the planet's treacherous terrain. It was their complete inability to understand human military tactics. They fought like no enemy humanity had ever faced, with a fluid, almost dance-like coordination that made traditional combat strategies useless. Commander Jake Morrison crouched beside Santos behind the twisted metal wreckage of their transport vehicle, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the killing field ahead. At 42, Morrison had seen action on 6 different worlds, but the way his jaw tightened told Santos everything she needed to know about their current situation. The ambush had caught their patrol completely off guard, and now 8 of his soldiers lay scattered across the rocky plateau, pinned down by enemy fire from positions that seemed to shift and change like smoke. "Santos, I need you to take Martinez and Chen and flank around those rock formations to the east," Morrison said, his voice steady despite the plasma bolts that sizzled overhead. "The rest of us will provide covering fire and try to draw their attention." Maria had served under Morrison for 18 months, long enough to read the subtle signs of stress in his posture. His left hand was unconsciously flexing, the way it did when he was calculating odds he didn't like. She could see what he couldn't, or wouldn't, admit. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly. Any flanking maneuver would expose her team to crossfire from at least 3 different positions. It was a suicide mission disguised as tactical brilliance, and Morrison was sending her because he trusted her to somehow make it work. The Zephyrians' plasma weapons crackled with an otherworldly energy that made the air itself seem to hum. Their technology was centuries ahead of human military hardware in some ways, yet they seemed baffled by humanity's stubborn refusal to follow logical military protocols. Where a rational species would have surrendered or retreated when faced with superior firepower and tactical positioning, humans just got angry and started improvising. Santos checked her M4 carbine, the familiar weight of human engineering solid in her hands. The weapon was primitive compared to Zephyrian plasma rifles, firing simple metal projectiles instead of coherent energy beams, but it had one advantage the alien seemed unable to grasp: reliability. Zephyrian weapons were elegant, efficient, and utterly dependent on their sophisticated targeting systems. Human weapons were crude, loud, and would keep firing even if half their components were blown away. "Sir, with respect, that flanking route is a meat grinder," Santos said, keeping her voice low. "They've got overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. We need a different plan." Morrison's green eyes flicked toward her, and she saw something she'd never seen before in her commanding officer's gaze: uncertainty. He was running the same calculations she was, seeing the same impossible odds, but his duty demanded he find a way forward. The other members of their patrol, Rodriguez, Baker, Williams, and the rookie Thompson, were looking to him for leadership, and leaders didn't have the luxury of admitting when a situation was hopeless. "I'm open to suggestions, Sergeant," Morrison replied, though they both knew there weren't any good options left. The plasma fire intensified, forcing them to press lower against their inadequate cover. Santos could smell the ozone in the air, could feel the heat from near misses warming the metal of their shelter. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the distinctive sound of Zephyrian combat formations repositioning, a sound like wind chimes mixed with the whisper of silk. They were beautiful, even in combat, moving with a grace that human soldiers could never match. But grace, Santos reflected, could be its own weakness. "Contact front," Rodriguez's voice cracked across the comm system. "They're moving to surround us." Santos raised her head just enough to peer around the edge of their cover, and her blood turned to ice. The Zephyrians weren't just repositioning. They were executing a perfect encirclement maneuver, their tall forms flowing across the rocky terrain like water finding the path of least resistance. In another few minutes, they would have the human patrol completely surrounded, with no avenue of escape. Morrison was already reaching for his radio to call for extraction, but Santos knew it was too late. The nearest human forces were 40 kilometers away, and by the time they could mount a rescue operation, this would all be over. The Zephyrians would have 8 more human prisoners to interrogate or 8 more bodies to study, depending on their mood. That's when Santos noticed something the others had missed. The Zephyrians moved with perfect coordination, but that coordination followed predictable patterns. They flowed like a school of fish or a flock of birds, each individual responding to the movements of the whole. It was mesmerizing, but it also meant they had difficulty adapting to truly chaotic, unpredictable behavior. Humans, on the other hand, specialized in chaos. "Sir," Santos said quietly, her mind already working through a plan that was either brilliant or insane. "What if we don't try to outflank them? What if we go straight through the middle instead?" Morrison stared at her as if she'd suggested they sprout wings and fly home. "Sergeant, that's not a flanking maneuver, that's a suicide charge." "Maybe," Santos admitted, "but it's also the last thing they'd expect. Look at their formation, sir. They're positioned to counter logical tactical responses. They're expecting us to try to escape or outmaneuver them. They're not expecting us to do something completely insane." Another volley of plasma fire forced them back into cover, and Santos could hear the Zephyrians' musical voices as they coordinated their final approach. Whatever decision they made, they had to make it now. Morrison looked at his M4, then at his remaining soldiers, then back at Santos. She could see him weighing their chances, calculating the odds of survival against the certain death that waited if they did nothing. "You know what, Sergeant?" he said finally, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Sometimes insane is all we've got left." The plan was madness wrapped in desperation, and tied together with the kind of human stubbornness that had carried the species from stone tools to starships. Morrison quickly outlined the details to his remaining soldiers, and Santos watched their faces cycle through disbelief, terror, and finally, the grim acceptance that came when all the safe options had been exhausted. "We move in 30 seconds, Morrison said, checking his weapon one final time. "Santos, you and Rodriguez take point. Williams and Baker, you're on the flanks. Thompson, you stick close to me and try not to get killed on your first combat mission." Private Thompson, barely 19 and still pale from the shock of seeing real combat for the first time, nodded with the kind of fierce determination that reminded Santos why she'd joined the service in the first place. Humanity might not be the strongest or smartest species in the galaxy, but they had something that all their advanced technology couldn't replicate: the ability to keep fighting when any rational being would quit. The Zephyrians' encirclement was almost complete, their graceful forms flowing across the alien landscape like deadly dancers. Santos could see at least 12 of them, their elongated limbs moving with perfect synchronization as they prepared to close the trap. Their plasma weapons hummed with barely contained energy, and their large, multifaceted eyes tracked every movement from the human position with predatory focus. What the Zephyrians didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that humans had evolved as persistence hunters on a world that tried to kill them every single day. When cornered, they didn't become more cautious. They became more dangerous. "Now," Morrison shouted. Santos exploded from cover like a woman possessed, her M4 already barking its harsh, primitive song as she charged straight toward the center of the Zephyrian formation. The aliens' surprised harmonic calls filled the air as their perfect coordination faltered for just a moment. And in that moment, Santos understood why humanity had survived long enough to reach the stars. They were too stupid to know when they were beaten. The first Zephyrian she encountered tried to bring his plasma rifle to bear, but Santos was already inside his effective range, and her crude human weapon didn't need sophisticated targeting systems to put metal projectiles into center mass. The alien's graceful form crumpled with a sound like breaking crystal, and his companion's perfect formation began to waver. Rodriguez was beside her, his rifle adding its voice to the chaos as they carved a path through the enemy line. The Zephyrians tried to adapt, their fluid movements becoming more frantic as they attempted to counter the human's suicidal charge, but their coordination was breaking down. They had trained to fight logical opponents, not maniacs who ran towards superior firepower while laughing. Williams and Baker hit the flanks exactly as planned. their weapons finding targets among the confused aliens who had been repositioning to complete the encirclement. The Zephyrians' beautiful formation collapsed into chaos as they tried to respond to attacks from multiple directions, their sophisticated tactics useless against an enemy that refused to follow any recognizable pattern. Santos felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with close-quarters combat, her body moving on autopilot as her training took over. Duck, fire, advance, acquire new target, fire again. The Zephyrians were fast and graceful, but they moved in predictable patterns, and Santos had spent years learning to shoot fast-moving targets. A plasma bolt seared past her head, close enough that she could feel the heat against her scalp, but she didn't slow down. Forward was the only direction that mattered now. Forward toward the enemy, forward toward whatever waited on the other side of this impossible charge, forward because stopping meant dying and humans were too stubborn to die quietly. She reached the center of what had been the Zephyrian formation and spun in a complete circle, her weapon tracking for new targets. The aliens' perfect coordination had shattered completely, their survivors scattered and confused by the humans' incomprehensible tactics. Some were trying to regroup, their musical voices calling out instructions in their fluid language, while others had simply broken and run. "Santos, behind you!" Rodriguez's warning came just as Santos felt rather than saw the movement at her 6 o'clock. She spun and fired in one motion, her M4 bucking against her shoulder as she put 3 rounds into the center of an approaching Zephyrian warrior. The alien's plasma weapon discharged harmlessly into the ground as he fell. The surviving Zephyrians were retreating now, their graceful forms flowing away across the rocky terrain like water finding a new course. Santos wanted to pursue them, to press the advantage while their formation was broken, but Morrison's voice cut through her battle rage. "Hold position, let them run." Santos forced herself to stop, her chest heaving as the adrenaline slowly faded and the reality of what they'd just accomplished began to sink in. They had charged straight through the center of a superior enemy force and lived to tell about it. It shouldn't have worked. By every tactical manual ever written, it should have been suicide. But tactical manuals were written by rational beings, and humanity had given up on rationality somewhere around the time they decided to strap themselves to controlled explosions and ride them into space. "Casualty report," Morrison called out, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands as he lowered his weapon. "Thompson took a graze on his left arm, but he's mobile," Williams reported. "Rodriguez has some burns from a near miss, nothing serious. The rest of us are green." Santos looked around at the battlefield, taking in the fallen Zephyrians and the scorch marks where plasma bolts had struck stone. They had faced impossible odds and somehow emerged victorious, but she knew this was just the beginning. The Crimson Talon would regroup, would adapt their tactics, would come at them again with renewed fury. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, they had proven something important, something that would ripple through the Zephyrian command structure and give their enemies pause. Humans didn't fight like any rational species should. They fought like humans. And sometimes that was enough. Morrison was already on his radio, calling for extraction and reporting their position, but Santos barely heard him. She was thinking about the look of utter confusion she'd seen in the Zephyrians' large eyes when the human charge had begun. It was the same look she'd seen on the faces of every enemy humanity had ever faced, from the battlefields of Earth to the moons of distant stars. It was the look of a predator suddenly realizing that its prey had teeth. 3 days after their impossible victory on the plateau, Santos found herself back in the field with Morrison's unit, this time as part of a larger operation to secure a Zephyrian communication hub. The brass had taken notice of their unconventional tactics, and suddenly everyone wanted to know how a single squad had broken a perfect Crimson Talon ambush through what the after-action report diplomatically termed aggressive close-quarters engagement. The truth was simpler and more terrifying than the military analysts wanted to admit. Humanity's greatest tactical advantage was their willingness to do things that made no tactical sense. The communication hub sat in a valley surrounded by crystalline formations that the Zephyrians used as natural amplifiers for their quantum-encrypted transmissions. Intelligence suggested that the Crimson Talon was using the facility to coordinate attacks across 3 different sectors, making it a high-value target that could significantly disrupt their operations. It was also defended by an estimated 50 enemy combatants with fixed positions, overlapping fields of fire, and home field advantage. A rational military force would have called for orbital bombardment or siege tactics. Human command had decided to send in 3 squads of ground troops with instructions to capture the facility intact. Santos checked her gear for the 3rd time as their transport approached the drop zone. Her M4 was clean and loaded, her magazines arranged for quick access, her body armor adjusted for maximum mobility. Everything was as ready as it could be, but she still felt the familiar knot of tension in her stomach that came before major operations. Morrison caught her eye across the transport's cramped interior and nodded slightly. They had developed an understanding over the past few days, a shared recognition that conventional tactics would get them all killed. The other squad leaders were already discussing flanking maneuvers and covering fire, but Santos could see in Morrison's eyes that he was thinking along different lines. "Listen up," Morrison said as they approached the drop zone. "Intelligence says we're looking at fixed defensive positions arranged in overlapping zones of fire. Standard doctrine would be to probe for weaknesses, identify supporting positions, and systematically reduce their defenses." Santos could practically hear the unspoken, but hanging in the recycled air of the transport. "But standard doctrine assumes we're fighting an enemy that thinks like we do," Morrison continued. "The Zephyrians don't think like humans. They think like computers, all logic and perfect coordination. So we're going to give them something they can't compute." Lieutenant Chen from 2nd Squad leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Sir, with respect, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop trying to outthink them and start out-crazying them instead," Morrison replied with a grin that made Santos nervous. "Santos, you want to explain your theory about Zephyrian formation psychology?" Santos felt the eyes of 24 soldiers focus on her, and she fought down the urge to remind Morrison that she was a staff sergeant, not a military theorist. But she had been thinking about their victory on the plateau, analyzing what had made their insane charge successful when every logical tactic had failed. "The Zephyrians move like a flock," she said finally. "Perfect coordination, instant adaptation, but only within predictable parameters. They're like a computer program running on really good hardware, incredibly efficient at solving known problems, but they crash when you input something they weren't designed to handle." "And humans," Morrison added, "are basically walking error messages. We don't do anything the way we're supposed to." The transport shuddered as they hit the atmosphere, and Santos could feel the familiar sensation of controlled falling that preceded every combat drop. Outside the small windows, she could see the alien landscape rushing up to meet them, all crystal formations and strange vegetation under the light of twin suns. "2 minutes to drop," the pilot announced over the comm. Morrison stood up, his hand gripping the overhead rail as the transport bounced through atmospheric turbulence. "Here's the plan," he said. "We're going to hit them from every direction at once, with no coordination, no formation, and no tactical sense whatsoever. Chen, your squad goes in from the north. Williams, you take the south approach. My squad goes straight through the middle." "Sir," Chen protested, "that's not a plan, that's organized chaos." "Exactly," Morrison replied. "And organized chaos is something humans excel at." The transport touched down in a clearing about 2 kilometers from the target, and Santos could immediately feel the difference in the air. Kepler 442b's atmosphere was thinner than Earth's, and the gravity was about 15% lighter, giving every movement a slightly floating quality that took some getting used to. The twin suns cast strange double shadows that shifted and danced as clouds passed overhead. Santos shouldered her pack and followed Morrison out of the transport, her boots crunching on the crystalline sand that covered most of the planet's surface. The other squads were already spreading out, their movements efficient and purposeful as they prepared for the approach to target. "Santos," Morrison said quietly as they moved away from the landing zone, "I want you to know that what we're about to do violates pretty much every principle of modern military science." "I figured that out back on the plateau, sir," Santos replied, "but it worked then." "Yeah, it did," Morrison admitted. "The question is whether we can do it again or if we just got lucky the first time." Santos considered this as they moved through the alien landscape, their boots leaving tracks in the strange sand that seemed to sparkle with its own inner light. The Zephyrian communication hub was invisible from their current position, hidden behind a ridge of crystal formations that rose like frozen music from the valley floor. Sir, she said finally, I think luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity, and we've been preparing our whole species' history for this kind of fight. Morrison looked at her with curiosity. How do you figure that? Humans have never been the strongest or the fastest or the smartest predator on Earth, Santos explained. We survived by being the most adaptable, the most persistent, and the most willing to try crazy things when the safe options didn't work. Every other species in the galaxy seems to have evolved past that point. They've become efficient, logical, predictable. She paused to check her weapon as they approached the ridge line. But efficiency is a luxury you can only afford when you're winning. When you're losing, you need chaos, and chaos is humanity's natural habitat. Morrison was quiet for a moment, considering her words as they climbed toward their assault position. Finally, he smiled, not the grim expression of a soldier facing impossible odds, but the genuine smile of someone who had just understood something important. You know what, Santos, he said. I think you might be right, and if you're not, we're all about to get very dead finding out. The Zephyrian communication hub sprawled across the valley floor like a work of alien art, its crystalline structures rising in perfect geometric harmony with the natural formations around them. Santos could see the defensive positions through her tactical scope, elegant emplacements that blended seamlessly with the environment while providing overlapping fields of fire across every approach route. It was beautiful, efficient, and absolutely logical, which made it exactly the kind of target that human military doctrine was designed to demolish. Positions look good from here, Chen's voice crackled over the comm from his northern approach. I count 12 visible defensive points, probably twice that many we can't see. Copy that, Williams replied from the south. My scope shows the same. These positions are textbook perfect, sir, too perfect. Morrison was studying the target through his own scope, his jaw working as he calculated angles and distances. Santos could practically see the wheels turning in her commander's mind, and she knew he was reaching the same conclusion she was. Any rational assault on this position would require at least a full company with heavy support. They had 3 understrength squads, and their own stubborn refusal to accept reality. All units, this is Morrison, he said into his comm. I'm looking at a fortress that was designed by computer and built by artists. It's got no weak points, no obvious vulnerabilities, and enough firepower to stop a mechanized assault. Santos heard the note of satisfaction in his voice and smiled grimly. She knew that tone. It was the same one he'd used right before ordering their suicidal charge on the plateau. Which means, Morrison continued, that whoever designed it has never fought humans before. All units prepare for simultaneous assault in 60 seconds. Remember, there is no plan beyond hitting them as hard and as chaotically as possible. Trust your training, trust your squad mates, and trust in the fundamental human ability to succeed through sheer bloody-mindedness. Sir, Chen's voice carried a note of uncertainty. Are you sure about this? Those defensive positions? We're designed to stop a logical enemy, Morrison cut him off. We're not logical, we're human. There's a difference. Santos finished her final equipment check and moved into position at Morrison's right shoulder. The valley spread out below them, beautiful and deadly in the light of the twin suns. She could see movement among the crystalline structures, Zephyrian defenders shifting positions, their graceful forms flowing like water between defensive points. They were repositioning to meet the expected human assault, their movements coordinated with the kind of perfect efficiency that had made them masters of their homeworld. Each defender knew exactly where every other defender was positioned, exactly what fields of fire they controlled, exactly how their individual actions contributed to the overall defensive strategy. It was militarily perfect, which meant it was about to encounter something it was completely unprepared for: human military imperfection. 30 seconds, Morrison announced. Santos could feel her heart rate climbing as combat adrenaline flooded her system. This was the moment she lived for and dreaded in equal measure, the instant when all the training and planning gave way to chaos and instinct. In 30 seconds, she would find out whether her theories about human adaptability were correct, or whether they were all about to die in a beautiful alien valley. 10 seconds. Santos brought her M4 to the ready position, feeling the familiar weight of human engineering in her hands. Around her, she could sense the other members of Morrison's squad making their final preparations. Rodriguez checking his grenade launcher, Williams adjusting his scope, Thompson trying to look like he wasn't terrified. 5, 4, 3, 2. Time seemed to slow as Santos rose from cover, her weapon already tracking toward the nearest defensive position. The Zephyrians had seen them coming, of course. Their sophisticated sensors had probably detected the human approach minutes ago. But seeing the enemy and understanding the enemy were two very different things. 1. Execute. Santos launched herself down the slope toward the communication hub, her boots sending up sprays of crystalline sand as she bounded through the lighter gravity. Her M4 barked its harsh song as she acquired her first target, a Zephyrian defender whose plasma rifle was swinging to track her movement. The alien's graceful form crumpled as her rounds found their mark, but Santos was already moving, already acquiring the next target. Around her, the valley erupted into chaos as 24 human soldiers hit the Zephyrian defensive positions from 3 different directions simultaneously. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Zephyrians had prepared for a coordinated assault with logical objectives and predictable timing. Instead, they were facing what could only be described as organized pandemonium, humans running, shooting, screaming, and generally behaving like the evolved apes they were. Santos reached the perimeter of the facility and rolled into cover behind one of the crystalline structures, feeling the heat of plasma bolts as they seared the air where she'd been standing. The Zephyrians were trying to adapt to the human assault, their musical voices calling out coordinates and targeting instructions, but their perfect coordination was breaking down under the sheer unpredictability of their enemies. "Rodriguez, suppressive fire on that tower," Morrison's voice cut through the chaos, and Santos heard the distinctive thump of grenade launcher as Rodriguez complied. The explosion sent crystal fragments flying in all directions, and the Zephyrian defensive position went silent. Santos used the distraction to advance deeper into the facility, her weapon tracking for targets among the geometric structures that housed the communication equipment. The Zephyrians were falling back, their defensive line collapsing as they tried to counter attacks that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A plasma bolt seared past her head, and Santos spun to see a Zephyrian defender emerging from concealment behind one of the larger structures. She put 2 rounds center mass before the alien could bring his weapon to bear, then immediately shifted position as return fire erupted from her previous location. The battle was flowing like liquid chaos through the crystalline maze of the communication hub, with neither side able to establish clear lines or predictable positions. It was exactly the kind of fight that favored the side with better instincts and faster adaptation, which meant it favored the humans. Santos reached what appeared to be the central communication array, a towering spire of crystal and metal that hummed with barely contained energy. Zephyrian technicians were attempting to evacuate sensitive equipment, their movements frantic as they tried to preserve their technology from the human assault. "Morrison, I've reached the primary array," Santos reported into her comm. "Multiple non-combatants attempting to secure equipment." "Secure the facility intact if possible," Morrison replied. "But don't take unnecessary risks. Dead heroes don't file reports." Santos smiled grimly and advanced on the communication array, her weapon ready but not immediately threatening. The Zephyrian technicians saw her approach and froze, their large eyes reflecting what might have been fear or confusion. They were clearly non-combatants, and Santos had no intention of harming them unnecessarily. But she was also a human soldier in the middle of a combat zone, and that meant she was about to do something that would probably terrify them completely. She was going to try to communicate. "Stand down," she shouted in her limited Zephyrian vocabulary, gesturing with her weapon for emphasis. "Facility secured, no harm if compliance." The technicians stared at her for a moment, probably trying to process the fact that a primitive human was attempting to speak their language. Then, slowly, they began to comply, their graceful hands moving away from their equipment as they stepped back from the communication array. Santos felt a surge of satisfaction as she realized that their impossible assault had actually worked. They had taken a heavily defended facility with minimal casualties through the simple expedient of refusing to follow any recognizable military doctrine. It shouldn't have been possible. But then again, humanity had been doing impossible things since they first decided to leave their homeworld and explore the galaxy. And this, Santos reflected as she secured the communication hub, was why the universe needed humans. Someone had to be willing to try the crazy option when all the logical ones failed. 6 hours after securing the communication hub, Santos found herself in the most dangerous position of her military career, sitting across a conference table from a Zephyrian diplomatic delegation, with Morrison beside her, and a room full of high-ranking officers watching every word. The successful capture of the facility had accomplished far more than disrupting Crimson Talon communications. The intelligence gathered from their quantum-encrypted networks had revealed the location of the extremist faction's main stronghold, their supply lines, and most importantly, evidence that they were planning a coordinated strike against human civilian settlements. But it had also done something unexpected. It had gotten the attention of the Zephyrian mainstream government, who had sent Ambassador Thalandra to negotiate a possible end to hostilities. Ambassador Thalandra was everything Santos expected from a Zephyrian diplomat: tall, graceful, with the kind of ethereal beauty that made humans feel clumsy and primitive by comparison. Her large, multifaceted eyes reflected intelligence and curiosity as she studied the human officers across the table, and when she spoke, her voice carried the musical quality that made Zephyrian language sound like poetry. "I must confess," the ambassador said in perfectly accented English, "that your species continues to surprise us, Staff Sergeant Santos. Our military analysts have been studying the recordings of your recent operations, and they are puzzled." Santos glanced at Morrison, who nodded slightly. They had expected this conversation, though neither of them had imagined it would happen so quickly or at such a high level. "Puzzled how, Ambassador?" Morrison asked diplomatically. Thalandra's expression shifted in a way that Santos had learned to recognize as the Zephyrian equivalent of confusion. "Your tactics make no logical sense. The assault on the communication hub should have failed catastrophically. Any rational military analysis would predict complete defeat when facing prepared defensive positions with superior firepower and positioning." "But we're not rational," Santos said quietly, earning a sharp look from Colonel Harrison, the senior human officer present. "With respect, ma'am, that's exactly the point." The ambassador's attention focused on Santos with laser intensity. "Please elaborate, Staff Sergeant." Santos felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just a tactical discussion anymore. This was a conversation about the fundamental nature of humanity itself, and how that nature fit into the wider galactic community. "Your people have achieved perfect military efficiency," Santos began carefully. "Your formations are flawless, your coordination is seamless, and your technology is centuries ahead of ours. But efficiency requires predictability, and predictability creates vulnerabilities." Thalandra leaned forward slightly, her large eyes reflecting what Santos hoped was interest rather than offense. "You are suggesting that our military superiority is actually a weakness." "I'm suggesting that military superiority is contextual," Santos replied. "Your forces are optimized to fight other advanced, logical species with predictable tactical doctrines, but humans, we're not advanced, and we're definitely not logical." Morrison cleared his throat softly, and Santos realized she was probably pushing the boundaries of diplomatic discourse. But the ambassador seemed genuinely fascinated by the conversation, so she continued. "Humans evolved on a world that was constantly trying to kill us," Santos explained. "We survived not by becoming efficient, but by becoming adaptable. We learned to solve problems by trying everything, even things that shouldn't work, especially things that shouldn't work." "The persistence hunting theory," Thalandra murmured, and Santos was surprised that the ambassador knew the term. "Your species evolved to pursue prey across vast distances, wearing down faster, stronger opponents through sheer endurance and refusal to give up." "Exactly, and that's not just how we hunt. It's how we think, how we fight, how we approach every problem we encounter. We don't stop trying just because something is impossible." The ambassador was quiet for a long moment, her multifaceted eyes reflecting what Santos had learned to recognize as deep thought. Finally, she spoke again, her musical voice carrying a note of something that might have been admiration. "The Crimson Talon has been studying human military doctrine for months," she said. "They have analyzed your formations, your standard tactics, your technological capabilities. They have prepared counter-strategies for every logical response to their operations." "But they haven't prepared for illogical responses," Morrison added with a slight smile. No, the Landra agreed, they have not. Because in all our recorded history, we have never encountered a species that succeeds through organized chaos. It is unprecedented. Colonel Harrison leaned forward at this point, his expression serious. Ambassador, are you saying that your government is willing to take action against the Crimson Talon? The Landra's attention shifted to the colonel, and Santos could see her diplomatic training taking over as she considered her response. The Crimson Talon has violated numerous interplanetary agreements with their attacks on human settlements. The fact that they have proven incapable of adapting to human military doctrine suggests that they are not the superior force they claim to be. She paused, her gaze returning to Santos. Your unconventional tactics have revealed a fundamental flaw in their strategic thinking. They assumed that superior technology and coordination would be sufficient to defeat any human response. They did not account for the possibility that humans would simply ignore the rules of engagement entirely. Santos felt a surge of pride at the ambassador's words, but also a growing sense of responsibility. Their success hadn't been just about individual heroism or tactical brilliance. It had been about demonstrating something essential about humanity's place in the galaxy. Ambassador, Santos said carefully, what happens now? To the Crimson Talon, I mean, but also to human-Zephyrian relations in general. The Landra considered this question for a long moment before responding. The Crimson Talon will face justice under Zephyrian law, with human assistance if desired. As for broader relations, she paused, and Santos thought she detected the faintest hint of a smile in the ambassador's expression. I believe the galactic community may need to reconsider some of our assumptions about military doctrine, she said finally. Your species has demonstrated that there are alternative approaches to conflict resolution that may prove valuable in future scenarios. Morrison caught Santos's eye across the table, and she could see the same thought reflected in his gaze. They had just changed the way an entire alien civilization thought about warfare. Not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through the simple human refusal to accept that some things were impossible. Later, after the diplomatic meetings had concluded and the formal agreements had been signed, Santos found herself standing on the observation deck of their transport ship, watching Kepler 442b shrink to a point of light in the viewport. Morrison joined her there, both of them silent as they contemplated everything that had happened. You know what the strangest part is? Morrison said finally. What's that, sir? We didn't win because we were better soldiers than the Zephyrians. We won because we were more human. Santos considered this as the ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying them home to a galaxy that had just learned something new about the species that refused to follow the rules. She thought about the look of confusion in Zephyrian eyes when faced with human unpredictability, about the way their perfect formations had crumbled under chaotic assault, about the ambassador's admission that their entire military doctrine needed revision. Maybe that's what the galaxy needs, she said quietly. Not more efficiency or more logic, but more humanity, more willingness to try the impossible when the possible isn't enough. Morrison nodded, his reflection ghostly in the viewport as stars streaked past in hyperspace. You know what, Santos? I think you might be right, and if you're not, well, we'll probably find some completely insane way to make it work anyway. Santos smiled, feeling the weight of their accomplishment settling into memory alongside the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, other species were probably learning to account for the human factor in their strategic planning. It was a good feeling, she decided. After all, if humanity was going to be the chaos element in galactic civilization, they might as well be good at it. The transport ship carried them home through the vast darkness between stars, bearing with them the proof that sometimes the best solution to an impossible problem was to be too human to realize it was impossible in the first place. And in the depths of space, where logic and efficiency reigned supreme among the elder races, that was exactly the kind of solution the galaxy needed. Even if they didn't know it yet.